Okay, the reason this video is referring to camels is it turned out that I have quite a few just principles or concepts that I have collected that are part of systems thinking, just part of the way I approach problem solving and engineering. And it just so happens that as I was telling some of these to a friend years ago, it seemed like half of them involve camels in terms of the way I'd always had them as stories. So that's kind of the genesis behind that, and it's really going to be part of like a pocket camel book that I've been working on. We'll run through these as quickly as possible just to give you an idea of some of the things that I'm basing the other videos on, so that you're not wondering why I have come to some conclusions, or you may be thinking something entirely different than I have been thinking. Systems thinking is how nature works. It will always produce the results that you are currently getting, whether they are desirable or undesirable results. If the system model doesn't predict or doesn't show the results that you're currently getting, then you need to change the perspective of that model. You need to zoom out and get better clarity on it. You can't change something until you understand what you currently have. So it's very important to have that reference model, or be able to look at the system as it currently exists and not just as you would like it to be. When looking at a system or a project plan, people tend to look at the tasks, how they're linked, and the timeline, but they leave out interdependencies and interactions. They leave these out because they are typically too complicated, or they don't understand them, or think that they're really of no consequence. After all, it's just the tasks and the things that need to get done that matter. And the reality is that all that really matters are those interdependencies and the interactions. That's where the variability is. That's where the control points are. The other things are really inconsequential. So this is where linear thinking and waterfall or breakdown structure really fails in the real world. There really is no such thing as a linear cause and effect, as in one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. That doesn't exist in the real world. What does exist are loops. Loops that reinforce, that feed upon themselves, and loops that correct that feeding upon. They're overlaid, they're woven together, and that fabric, meshed together, is what the net effect of a system has in terms of outputs. Nature has no hard edges or corners, or for that matter, there is no digital in the real world. Everything is analog. Everything has a gradient, or everything has graduations. There isn't a 1 or a 0. Everything in nature is a spectrum. Everything is curved. There aren't sharp edges. There aren't sharp distinctions in terms of like a yes or a no, or a 1 or a 0. And I think that's important to realize, that those are all constructs that we have made to simplify the world, but it certainly doesn't represent the way the world operates. The The KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid, is really quite silly, I think. But so is the opposite, saying that everything is just infinitely complex. Because neither the complex or KISS principle exists in nature. What does happen is that we have a simple approach that grows into complexity as we try to understand it. And the other side of complexity is an elegant simplicity. We're able to emerge out of all that complexity with a simple representation. Einstein's equation E equals mc squared certainly looks like something a child could write, but that is a true elegant simplicity that had a great deal of complexity to get through in order to distill it down to that point. This is a rule of thumb that says, why would you want to use rules of thumb when you actually have facts available? These are only useful when there isn't any reality to look at. If they are commingled with facts, then you can be rest assured that they are there for deceptive reasons. I like this little observation that in a corporation we call it a bureaucracy. In a person we call it insanity. They are exactly the same. Okay, let's talk weasel words. I'll just rattle off a few of them here to get the idea. A growing body of evidence. People say, it has been claimed that. Critics say, it stands to reason that. Questions have been raised. It is known that. Officially it is known as, it turns out that. Studies show. When you hear these kinds of words, you know something is up. Just like we talked a second ago, if you have actual numbers to look at, why would you want to look at rules of thumb? Similarly, then why would you want to blur and confuse the issue by introducing all these other terms? You don't need to have speculation. You don't need to bring in probable reasons or contributing factors or any of these other words that are typically used. If the facts are clear, then that's all you need. Show me somebody who uses weasel words, and I will show you someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, or they have a hidden agenda, or most likely, both. Responsibility and authority must always go hand in hand. You can't give someone responsibility without authority, and vice versa, unless you want chaos and organizational upheaval. These have to go hand in hand. It's amazing how often they are not. A solution is meaningless unless it's put in context of organizational goals. This has to be done for any decision. It has to be a habit an organization gets into. You can't say that we replaced a part because it was broken, unless your mission statement is to replace broken parts. A properly phrased problem statement has 3 parts to it. What happened, what needs to be done, and in what form should the solution take. Just to say that, my muffler fell off, that doesn't really give that person very much to go off of other than mind reading or to interpret things using their own mindset and their own experience and their own context. But that doesn't really lend itself to a solution that's suited to the person who has the problem. And this is the way you are able to frame things correctly, even though you don't know what a solution is. So you can't necessarily say, here's what I want to happen, because I don't even know what the solution might be because I don't understand the problem. But you can say that the muffler seems to have fallen off, it needs to be fixed, and it needs to be put back to factory standards. Now that tells the person exactly what you're looking for. As opposed to saying, the muffler fell off, I need to be able to get home tonight, I need to have it not throw sparks down the road. That would give a completely different solution than the first one. If we don't phrase it that way, we just say, my muffler fell off, we're not going to get necessarily a solution that's well suited. There are 2 authorities on every subject matter in an organization. There is an organizational person placed in charge of something, and then there is the reality-driven person that is in charge of that subject matter. So if I have somebody in charge of issuing purchase orders, most likely it's going to be the vice president of issuing purchase orders or something of that nature, a management position. That would be the official organization-placed authority. But there's somewhere the person who actually does the work and does it the most and has done it the longest and really understands the reality of how it plays out, because there's always gaps between what we think happens and what actually happens. Both are important, but both are very different, and it's important to not commingle them. I love this one. Parts are never bad. They may be faulty, they may be flaky, they may be defective, they might even be naughty, but they're never bad. When looking at a system that has numbers involved, whether it be money or just some measurement that has absolute values or some type of measurement associated with it, that value itself, the actual number, is rarely that significant in the system in terms of understanding cause and effect. What is significant is when that number varies from some norm. The variation is what causes instability and what causes a oscillation or a building of more and more instability. So it's important to look at the timing of things when expenses are made, how the seasonality, and how the variance in value percolates through the system, because that's really what causes instability. Timing is truly everything when it comes to numbers. I'm willing to place almost a blanket bet anywhere, anytime, that if there were 10 people in a room and you passed a 3x5 card around and asked each person to write down what problem they are working on, I would say 9 out of 10 are going to be inconsistent to the point where it's counterproductive. It's amazing how much time will go into organizing a meeting, having a meeting, following up a meeting, but we're working on different problems, different pieces of it, different abstractions of it. It's not as simple as it seems, particularly when you have people of all different backgrounds who have their own slant on things. I have been in meetings as a consultant that have lasted 2 or 3 hours that have been considered a rousing success, even though I sat there through the whole thing knowing that the word schedule had 3 very different definitions, and there were engineers, there were marketing people, there were management people in the room, and somehow we got through the entire meeting having an ambiguous definition. For one group, it meant schedule as in a type of pipe. For another group, it meant the schedule that goes on building plans, as in a schedule of material. And for the other group, they were talking about the work schedule in the shop. And amazingly, you can work through an entire meeting and nobody realizes that we're using the word schedule interchangeably. And it was quite disturbing at the end of the meeting to have each person write down what they thought the word schedule means on a 3x5 card, and we found out that it was like 3 separate meetings just took place, and there was nothing in terms of communication and clarity as we thought there was. Happens a lot. I think it's really easy to get distracted when you're looking to seek a goal when the very thing that you use to get towards the goal is counterproductive. It's kind of like when I was a kid, I always thought it was interesting how they used plastic to wrap up plastic. In this case, I think it's if your goal is to perhaps be more efficient and have fewer meetings, it's amazing how many meetings will go in to discuss that, but somehow we don't count those meetings when we're trying to figure out how to have fewer meetings. And I understand you have to have a meeting to do that, but the only way you're going to accomplish that is to find a new way of functioning, not to do the old thing and then expect it to actually get traction within the organization. So if you remember on The Price is Right, one of the oldest games they've had, and there's no way I'm going to be able to draw this, but it was that yodeler guy that was on this track going up, and then they would guess prices, and it goes up so many notches. It's kind of the model, I think, when I'm looking at working towards a goal, especially when it's taking place over weeks or months, over different sessions. Every time, if we're trying to have fewer meetings, every time we have a meeting, this would increment up. And I understand that sometimes you have to increment up, sometimes you go back, but you have to keep in mind that the goal is out here and it's very close to the cliff. So if you take 20 meetings in order to figure out how to have 19 fewer meetings, over the cliff you go. And that's pretty easy to do if you don't have some type of little metric there to keep you on track. Okay, and then lastly, the premise that we should not assume anything is in fact an erroneous assumption. I think these are the kinds of catchphrases that get us in trouble because it sounds really good. We shouldn't assume anything, and therefore it gives people permission to assume whatever they want, assuming that everything has already been revealed once the assumption period is over. And we get into these little crazy games like that. So if we were to actually take that seriously and look at every conceivable assumption that would be needing to be validated, we'd be immobilized. We'd be looking at the trivial to the profound, trying to have no assumptions, and you really do need to look at them all because you don't know if there's an assumption until you see if there's an assumption. It's a riddle. So assumptions are based on another assumption that are not yet validated. So you have stacking assumptions, which means you need to drill down into all of these. So this list becomes infinite. The assumptions within assumptions is not a very structured or consistent thing to navigate. It's very much dependent on a person's perceptions, background, and the way they view the world. It's going to be very difficult to traverse. The second one is the list of assumptions to validate comes from each person's perception of what they or others are to be assuming, which is an assumption. So we have to play this riddle where somehow we think we can actually know all the things that we're assuming, which is an assumption. And the third one is the assumptions most likely to benefit from validation are those that are not known until they are encountered due to negative consequences. So this is the thing that you can't know it until you can know it. So how are you supposed to look at those assumptions when you haven't even encountered them yet? So how do you deal with this? You stop the silly games of trying to say, let's have, open and honest communication. Let's have no assumptions. A better way is to have a continuous improvement, a series of approximations towards solutions so that you're constantly validating and improving what you've done. So if you're having a meeting, you would then recap the previous meeting, perhaps do active listening, have somebody else recap it, see if it comes back. If there's something that doesn't quite sound right, then you go after that and kind of see where the assumptions are. By looking at it different ways, different directions, and continuously validating the overall process, then I think that assumptions work themselves out, and then you deal with them as they come up. I think this can be taken as something very negative, where I am always looking at something from a cause and effect standpoint, being very critical of it. And I think if you view it as I'm criticizing people, then I agree, it sounds very negative. Or if you think that it is all about perfectionism or nitpicking, then that's the antithesis of what I'm trying to do. And I certainly have fallen into that trap, and I need to be corrected on that. But that's not what this is about. It's about being very positive and optimistic in the sense that we want to have the best possible outcome for everybody, and therefore we need to be extremely critical of the system. That would be everything as a whole, because that's what's producing whatever it is that we're getting. If we like it or don't like it, the system is producing it. So if we want something to be different, and if we truly want to help people, then we need to be extremely critical of the system. But that is not the ends. The ends is not to be critical, it's to help people. And if that is not being done, or if that is not desirable, then there really is no purpose in doing the systems analysis. But if we're trying to become more effective, we're trying to get more bang for the buck, we're trying to get better use out of resources, we're trying to think outside the box, and we're looking for elegant solutions that other people haven't come up with, then that's exactly how you get there, is by being relentless in pursuit of understanding and then improving the system. And to do that, you have to be critical. So if you want to be a really, really good painter, you can surround yourself with people who just tell you that you're just wonderful, and you'll pretty much just get what you want then. You'll be a mediocre painter who thinks he's wonderful. Or you can bring people into your life, throughout your life, who are going to be successively more critical of your work. Okay, another one is similar to this one, that is that systems thinking is really all about believing in people. Again, it can sound like it's being critical of people, but it's not about any one person, but about the system, and then to be able to show how each person's contribution to that system is making the system produce the results that it is. But if we can point out at this, each of our contributions is bringing about something that we don't want, then that gives us an actual chance of doing something that has a good chance of producing better results for ourselves. So it really is about believing in people, but it also means having to be real and to understand how our interaction with that system is producing the results that we're getting. And it's not always important about if we think it's right or wrong, or it should or it shouldn't. It's more about it just is, and that's just the way things are. And it's very kind of matter of fact and factual in nature. So, but again, I think that is a fundamental belief in people. A story I like to give is, if you're flying to, let's say, Miami for a winter vacation, in your mind you're probably daydreaming about how nice it's going to be, how you left Minnesota at 10 degrees below zero and it's going to be like 85 when you arrive, and that's what's on your mind. What's on the pilot's mind as he sits back for like 2.5 hours and has nothing to do as you're just in level flight? Is that where your pilot's mind is? Well, some people would say it should be, because you want the leader to be thinking positive, constructive thoughts and not being negative. But in reality, that pilot's thinking about where to ditch the plane, how to dump fuel, which airport to land should something mechanically fail. I mean, they're thinking all of these worst case scenarios the entire way down there. And that could be viewed as a negative thing. Why would you want somebody who is commanding the ship to be thinking worst case crash scenarios? well, that's what you want if you want to arrive safely, because that role is all about being prepared for eventualities. So that person is going to be thinking of all the worst case scenarios so that if something should happen, it won't become a worst case scenario. So that is the most positive way a person in that role can behave. My passion or my drive behind some of this stuff confuses people. Then I do get very passionate. I do get very driven about finding a way to save money and improve the way that we function simultaneously. So if we can free up $1,000 and get better maintenance on something, then that is worth having some introspection and some conflict. And life really is a zero-sum game. There's only so much money, only so much resources, and only so much to go around. So I think that the more that we can leverage is something certainly worth pursuing. And that's my drive behind this stuff. I can also change from week to week, day to day in terms of my position on something. And it looks like a roller coaster at times, and I suppose it could be just for personal reasons, but I think there's two things that typically are going on. And one is that the understanding of the system, the levels of approximation, the zooming out to get a bigger, broader view, all those things change the conditions, change my understanding. And that is an evolutionary process. So at one point you may be inclined to be thinking about it in this way, but then you look at it from a different perspective, or you step back a little bit, or you talk to somebody else and you look at it from maybe just the opposite perspective. So that doesn't mean either one is necessarily right, or that I'm being duplicitous or wishy-washy. I think that's part of this process, that you're willing to have different perspectives, having different viewpoints of it that are going to not only evolve, but are intentionally going to be opposing just for the sake of being able to understand the system better. But those things aren't to be confused with the science, the facts, the evidence of root cause analysis and really understanding what's going on. Those are things to bring more insight, and that as time goes forward, those things will settle out. That roller coaster will become less of, less high and less low, and fewer changes as the system settles out and we understand it better. If it gets worse, then there's something else going on. Most likely it's because I would be put in a position where I have different roles. We all have this from time to time, where we have a role as perhaps a congregant, and then we have a role as leader. And we have to, as leaders, toe the rope. We have to step in line, and if the organization's doing something we don't agree with, we need to get in step with. But at the same time, as a congregant, we have the right to not agree with that. So that becomes a natural opposing set of roles that, for the most part, shouldn't be a problem. I think that fits into the overall system, that if the system's analysis is broad enough and deep enough, it will understand that those dynamics are taking place, and that is actually valuable information that people who are doing this analysis would welcome, to be able to hear that there is a conflict between the way that you look at this, like from a leader's standpoint versus a congregant versus your understanding of spiritual pursuit. I think that those conflicts are really valuable things. But in an unhealthy organization, these roles actually become more galvanized, more distinct, and that can then cause this changing of opinion or changing of position to be a real cyclical thing depending on the situation. So you could be in a meeting and have one opinion and be outside the meeting and have the exact opposite opinion. And that's simply unhealthy behavior, but I don't know that that's always a manifestation of the person as it is the reality of the system that they're living in. And for some of us who have systems thinking as our foundation, this becomes a very transparent and, shall I say, dramatic swing, because we try to elevate it so that it becomes more obvious that that disconnect exists,